military working dog, looked healthy from across the examination room. His coat was clean. His harness was properly fitted. His handler stood beside him in a spotless Navy uniform. Nothing about the appointment looked unusual. But the moment Nurse Sienna Brooks watched the dog walk through the hospital doors, something bothered her. Not his injury, not his behavior. His movement, he was too slow, too tired, and for a highly trained military K-9 who was supposed to be active, alert, and physically conditioned, the difference was impossible for her to ignore. She watched him lower himself onto the examination floor. Then she looked at his handler. How long has he been like this? The SEAL officer frowned. Like what? Sienna looked at the dog again. Like he's running on empty. The officer laughed nervously. He's just tired. Sienna didn't smile. Because she had spent enough time around working animals to know the difference between tired and depleted. And what she was about to discover would leave the hospital administration asking a much more serious question. Who had been responsible for feeding this dog? At 8:12 on a clear Tuesday morning, the veterinary wing of Harbor Ridge Naval Medical Center was operating normally. The waiting area was quiet. The examination rooms were clean. Technicians were preparing for several scheduled appointments. Then a Navy handler entered with a large black and tan German Shepherd. His name was Rook. He was 6 years old, broad-chested and powerfully built, with intelligent dark brown eyes and a faded olive tactical K-9 harness. His handler, Petty Officer First Class Mason Reed, held the leash loosely. Rook walked beside him. But Sienna noticed immediately that the dog wasn't moving like a healthy working animal. His head was slightly lowered, his stride lacked energy. And when they stopped, Rook didn't look around the room, he simply sat. Sienna watched from the nurse's station. She didn't say anything, she waited. Mason approached the examination desk. Routine medical evaluation. The receptionist checked the appointment. Rook? Yes. Everything okay? Mason nodded. He's been cleared for duty. Sienna looked up. That sentence made her pay closer attention. Cleared for duty, yet the dog looked exhausted. She watched him stand. He did it slowly. Too slowly. Then he followed Mason into the examination room. Sienna picked up the clipboard. Let me assist. Dr. Leah Whitmore, the veterinary physician, greeted them. Morning, Mason. Morning. Doctor. Rook stood beside him. Dr. Whitmore smiled. How's our boy? Mason rubbed the dog's neck. Fine. Rook looked at the veterinarian, then looked away. Dr. Whitmore crouched. Come here, Rook. The dog approached. She examined his eyes, his ears, his gums, his paws. His temperature was normal. His heart rate was acceptable. Nothing immediately explained the lack of energy. Dr. Whitmore looked at Sienna. Anything you've noticed? Sienna hesitated. She didn't want to make an accusation based on a first impression. His energy seems unusually low. Mason answered before the doctor could. He's been working hard. Sienna looked at him. How much exercise? Normal schedule. And food? Mason shrugged. Standard K-9 ration. Sienna nodded. That answer should have ended the question. Instead, it made her more curious. What does he eat? Mason looked slightly uncomfortable. His assigned diet. Dr. Whitmore glanced at him. Which formulation? Mason named the ration. Sienna recognized it. It was a legitimate working dog diet. Appropriate for a military working dog. So why did Rook look like he wasn't getting enough from it? She watched the dog again. He was sitting quietly, almost too quietly. A working dog waiting for a treat would usually show some anticipation. Rook barely reacted when Mason opened a container. Sienna frowned. Dr. Whitmore noticed. You see something? I'm not sure. She walked closer to Rook. The dog looked up at her. Sienna crouched. "Hey, buddy." Rook's ears moved. She placed a hand near his shoulder. His muscles felt firm. But there was less conditioning than she expected. She looked at his ribs. They weren't dangerously visible. There was no obvious neglect, nothing dramatic. But something was off. She stood. "When was his last full meal?" Mason answered. "Last night." "What time?" "About 7. "And when is he scheduled to eat again?" "After training." Sienna looked at the clock. 8:31 a.m. "He's training today?" "Yes." "How long?" "About 2 hours." Sienna looked at Rook, then at Mason. "Before he eats?" Mason nodded. "That's the normal schedule." Sienna didn't argue, but she wrote something down. Dr. Whitmore noticed. "What are you thinking?" Sienna lowered her voice. "I'm thinking we should look at his nutrition log." The log was brought in several minutes later. Sienna reviewed it carefully. The listed diet appeared appropriate. The portions, however, were inconsistent. One day showed a full working dog ration. Another showed a reduced amount. Another was marked simply adjusted. Sienna looked up. "Who adjusts his portions?" Mason hesitated. "Handlers." "Why?" "Depends on activity." "Who approves the changes?" Mason didn't answer immediately. Dr. Whitmore looked at him. "Mason?" He sighed. "Sometimes the handlers make adjustments." Sienna felt something tighten in her chest. "Without veterinary approval?" "It's not unusual." Dr. Whitmore frowned. "It should be documented." "It is." Sienna looked back at the log. There were several days where Rook had received significantly less food than expected for his activity level, and the timing was consistent. His reduced portions appeared on training-heavy days. She looked at the dog suddenly. His low energy made sense. Not because someone had necessarily intended to hurt him, but because someone may have been treating his food intake like a performance variable instead of a medical requirement. And that could become dangerous. Sienna asked for Rook's recent performance records. They arrived 15 minutes later. The numbers were striking. His training endurance had declined over the previous month. His recovery time had increased, his activity had decreased. And yet his medical notes repeatedly described him as less energetic than usual. Sienna looked at Dr. Whitmore. "How long has this been happening?" The veterinarian studied the records. "At least 3 weeks." Mason looked surprised. "I thought he was just getting older." Sienna looked at Rook. 6 isn't old for him. Dr. Whitmore nodded. "No." Mason became quiet. Sienna didn't accuse him. Instead, she asked, "Can I see the actual food containers?" Mason frowned. "Why?" "Because I want to compare what he's supposed to receive with what he's actually receiving." Dr. Whitmore nodded. "Good idea." They found the storage records. The assigned ration was correct. But another entry caught Sienna's attention. A handwritten note. "Reduced due to sluggishness." She stared at it, then read it again. Rook had been eating less because he appeared sluggish. But reducing his food intake could have been contributing to the sluggishness in the first place. It was a cycle. Less energy, less food, less energy again. Sienna looked at Dr. Whitmore. "This needs to stop." The veterinarian nodded. "Agreed." Mason looked uneasy. "Are you saying his diet is causing this?" Sienna answered carefully. "I'm saying we don't have enough evidence to blame one thing yet," she pointed toward the records. "But we have enough evidence to investigate it." That distinction mattered. She wasn't accusing anyone. She was protecting the dog. Dr. Whitmore ordered additional blood work and a controlled nutritional assessment. Rook remained in the hospital for observation. Sienna stayed involved. She monitored his hydration. She recorded his appetite. She watched his energy after eating. And over the next several hours, something became obvious. After receiving an appropriate veterinary-approved meal, Rook became more alert. His ears lifted. He watched people passing the room. When Sienna walked by, his head followed her. Later, he stood without being asked. Mason noticed. He's never done that this quickly. Sienna smiled. That's a good sign. Rook walked toward the examination room door. His gait wasn't perfect, but he looked different. More present, more awake. Dr. Whitmore checked his notes. This is interesting, Sienna nodded. We need more data. At 3:40 that afternoon, Rook was noticeably more energetic. He picked up his favorite training toy. Mason stared at him. That's the first time he's touched that in weeks. Sienna looked at the dog. Rook held the toy proudly. For the first time that morning, he looked like the military working dog everyone expected him to be. Mason crouched. Good boy. Rook dropped the toy, then picked it up again. Dr. Whitmore smiled. That's encouraging. Sienna nodded, but she wasn't celebrating yet, because the nutrition records still bothered her. Someone had been repeatedly reducing this dog's food, and the reason written in the records was not supported by a veterinary assessment. She looked at Mason, who supervises his feeding schedule. Mason gave her a name. Sienna wrote it down, then asked, Who supervises the handlers? Mason's expression changed. Why? Sienna looked toward Rook. Because if his diet has been changed without proper medical oversight, someone needs to know. Mason was silent, then nodded. You're right. The next morning, Sienna arrived early. Rook was already awake. He stood when she entered. His tail moved. She smiled. Morning. He walked toward her. Mason watched from behind. You've got a fan, Sienna laughed. I think he's just hungry. But Rook's improvement was now impossible to ignore. The veterinarian reviewed the new observations. His energy was better. His appetite was better. His responsiveness was better. His physical examination remained stable, and the pattern raised a serious concern. Dr. Whitmore looked at Sienna. We need to report this. Sienna nodded. Yes. Mason looked worried. Will this get someone in trouble? Sienna paused. That's not my decision. She looked at Rook. My responsibility is making sure the dog gets the care he needs. That afternoon, a senior Navy officer arrived at the veterinary wing, Commander Julian Mercer. The regional military working dog program officer entered the examination room with a serious expression. He had been briefed about Rook. He looked at the dog, then at the medical records, then at Sienna. You're the nurse who raised the concern? Sienna nodded. Yes, sir. He looked at Rook. What made you notice? Sienna answered honestly. He didn't look sick. The commander frowned. He didn't? No. She looked at Rook. He looked depleted. The commander listened. And then, I reviewed his nutrition and training records. Mercer took the file. His expression became increasingly serious as he read. Finally, he looked at Mason. Who authorized these reductions? Mason swallowed. Sir. The commander raised a hand. I want the names. The room went silent. Sienna stood beside Rook. She hadn't expected this. Neither had Mason. Commander Mercer closed the folder. We're going to investigate this properly. Then he looked at Sienna. And Nurse Brooks? She looked up. Yes, sir. He nodded toward Rook. Thank you for noticing what everyone else overlooked. Sienna glanced at the dog. Rook looked back at her, and she realized that this routine checkup had just become something much bigger. Because, the next morning, the handlers responsible for Rook's feeding schedule would receive formal warning notices, and the commander was going to ask them one question they weren't prepared to answer. Why had they been reducing a military working dog's diet without proper veterinary approval? By 7:10 the following morning, Rook was no longer the same dog who had walked into Harbor Ridge Naval Medical Center 2 days earlier. He was standing at the examination room door before anyone called him. His ears were alert. His eyes were bright. And when Sienna Brooks entered the room, his tail moved immediately. She smiled. Good morning, Rook. The German Shepherd walked toward her. Mason Reed watched from the other side of the room. That's a completely different dog. Sienna nodded. He's responding to the nutrition change. Dr. Leah Whitmore entered with the latest results. His blood work supports what we're seeing clinically. Nothing suggests an immediate disease process that explains the prolonged fatigue. Mason looked at the records. So it really could have been the feeding schedule. Potentially, Dr. Whitmore said. But we need to be careful. We haven't proven causation yet. Sienna nodded. Which is why the records matter. Dr. Whitmore looked at her. Exactly. Commander Julian Mercer arrived less than an hour later. He carried a folder. His expression was serious. Mason stood immediately. Sir. Mercer nodded. Petty officer. Then he looked at Rook. The dog stood beside Sienna. Mercer studied him for several seconds. This is Rook? Yes, sir. He looks better, Sienna answered. He is. Mercer looked at the medical file. How much? Dr. Whitmore explained the changes. Improved appetite, improved alertness, improved activity, more normal recovery after controlled exercise. Mercer listened carefully. Then he opened the nutrition records. His expression hardened. Who made these adjustments? Mason answered honestly. Several handlers, sir. Names? Mason gave them. Mercer wrote them down. Who approved them? Mason hesitated. No one formally. The room went silent. Mercer slowly closed the folder. Then we have a problem. The commander didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness made the room even quieter. Military working dogs are not personal property. He looked at Mason. They are assigned service animals with medical and operational requirements. Mason nodded. Yes, sir. Feeding changes that affect performance or health require proper documentation and oversight. Understood. Mercer looked toward Rook. And this dog was receiving less food on days when his workload increased? Mason looked down. Yes, sir. Mercer took a breath. That's exactly backward. Sienna remained silent. She didn't want to become part of a disciplinary conversation. Her role had been simple. Notice something. Report it. Make sure Rook was cared for. But Mercer turned toward her. Nurse Brooks? Sir? Did you report this because you suspected someone was deliberately harming him? Sienna shook her head. No, sir. Then why? She looked at Rook. Because the records didn't match the dog. Mercer waited, she continued. He was being described as sluggish, but his diet was being reduced because he was sluggish. That didn't make sense. Mercer nodded slowly. Good. He looked at Rook again. You trusted your observation. Sienna smiled faintly. I trusted the pattern. The investigation began that afternoon. The handlers responsible for Rook's feeding records were called separately. No accusations were made before the facts were established. That was important to Mercer. He wanted documentation. Who changed the portions? Why? Who was supervising the feeding? Were other K9s being handled the same way? Were the reductions temporary? Were they based on legitimate veterinary recommendations? Or had informal habits become routine? The questions continued for hours. Meanwhile, Rook remained under veterinary observation. Sienna continued monitoring him. His improvement continued. And that became one of the most important pieces of evidence. At 2:20 p.m., Rook completed a controlled walk. Mason held the leash. Sienna walked several steps behind them. The German Shepherd moved confidently through the corridor. A technician rolled a cart across the hallway. Rook turned his head, then continued. Mason smiled. 2 days ago, he wouldn't have bothered looking. Sienna nodded. His energy is coming back. They reached the end of the corridor. Mason stopped. Rook sat. Then looked at Sienna. She smiled. Good boy. Mason looked at her. You know what's strange? What? He's never been this attached to hospital staff. Sienna laughed. I'm not sure attached is the right word. Mason shook his head. He waits for you. She looked at Rook. The dog was still watching her. She smiled. Maybe he knows I bring food. Mason laughed. Maybe. But the investigation was uncovering something more serious. Commander Mercer discovered that Rook's feeding adjustments weren't isolated. 2 other military working dogs had similar notes. Reduced portions, increased training, peel-surd fatigue. And in one case, the handler had written, Dog appears slower than usual. The veterinarian's response was missing. Mercer stared at the file. How many? His assistant answered, 3 dogs in this unit. Mercer looked up. 3? Yes, sir. Get me the complete feeding records for every K9 under this command. Yes, sir. Mercer closed his office door. This was no longer simply about Rook. The next morning, Sienna was called into a meeting. She expected to see Dr. Whitmore. Instead, Commander Mercer was there. So was the hospital director. Sienna sat down. Mercer placed several files on the table. You're not in trouble. She smiled nervously. I wasn't worried. The director laughed softly. You should have been. Mercer looked at her. You noticed something that could have been overlooked for months. Sienna shook her head. The medical records were there, but nobody connected them. He paused. You did. Sienna looked uncomfortable. I just noticed the dog wasn't himself. Mercer nodded. That's exactly the point. He opened another file. Rook's activity records show declining endurance. Another. His feeding records show reduced intake. Another. His medical notes show fatigue. He looked at Sienna. 3 different departments had pieces of the story. Sienna understood. No one put them together. Exactly. Mercer leaned back. That happens more often than people realize. He paused. But with a military working dog, it can have consequences. Sienna nodded. Yes, sir. That afternoon, the handlers involved were formally notified. The warning letters did not accuse them of intentionally harming the dogs. They documented the unauthorized feeding adjustments and instructed the handlers to follow approved veterinary protocols. Additional supervision was ordered. All feeding records would now be reviewed. Any dietary adjustment required documented veterinary approval. And every K9 would undergo a nutritional and performance assessment. It was firm. But fair. Mercer wanted accountability without assuming intent that hadn't been proven. Mason came to the recovery room after receiving his own instructions. He looked embarrassed. Sienna noticed. Are you okay? He nodded. I'm fine. He looked at Rook. I should have noticed. Sienna shook her head. Don't do that. What? Take responsibility for something you didn't know. Mason looked at her. I was his handler. And you brought him here. She smiled. That's what mattered. Mason looked down. Still. Rook stepped toward him. Mason crouched. The dog rested his head against his shoulder. Mason closed his eyes. I'm sorry, buddy. Rook's tail moved. Sienna watched quietly. That evening, Mason came back with Rook's updated feeding plan. It was detailed. Portions adjusted according to workload. Hydration requirements. Training day modifications. RET day modifications. Veterinary review points. Everything documented. Sienna looked over the plan. That's much better, Mason nodded. Commander Mercer wants every handler retrained. Good. He smiled. You really care about these dogs. Sienna looked at Rook. Someone has to. Mason shook his head. No. He looked at her. Everyone should. 3 days later, Rook was cleared to return to his unit for restricted duty. His condition had improved significantly. He was eating normally. His energy was stable. His training schedule had been reduced temporarily. And his veterinary follow-up was scheduled. Mason stood beside him in the hospital lobby. Rook looked toward the doors. Then back at Sienna. She crouched. You're going home. His tail moved. Mason smiled. He's going to miss you. Sienna laughed. I'm sure he'll survive. Rook gently touched his nose to her hand. She smiled. Okay. She scratched his ears. I'll miss you too. Before leaving, Commander Mercer approached Sienna. He held out his hand. She shook it. You did the right thing. Sienna nodded. Thank you, sir. He looked at Rook. Because you spoke up, we're changing the feeding oversight for the entire K9 program. Sienna looked surprised. I didn't expect that. You shouldn't. He smiled. People who do the right thing shouldn't do it expecting a reward. He paused. They should do it because the animal can't speak for itself. Sienna looked at Rook. The German shepherd stood proudly beside Mason. His coat looked brighter. His eyes were clearer. His posture had changed completely. He looked like himself again. As Mason led Rook toward the exit, the dog stopped. He turned around. Sienna raised her hand. Go on. Rook stared at her. Then Mason gently called his name. Rook finally turned and walked away. Sienna watched them disappear through the doors. Dr. Whitmore stepped beside her. You know what I think? Sienna smiled. What? I think Rook was lucky. Because he came here? Dr. Whitmore shook her head. Because someone noticed. Sienna looked toward the empty doorway. Anyone could have. Maybe. The veterinarian smiled. But they didn't. If you're enjoying Rook's story, consider subscribing. We tell these stories because sometimes the most important heroes aren't the people giving orders. They're the people who notice when something is wrong and have the courage to speak up. Sienna returned to her normal duties after that. No promotion, no dramatic ceremony, no special title. She went back to checking patients, preparing rooms, and helping the veterinary team. But something had changed. The staff listened more closely when she raised a concern. Doctors asked what she had noticed. Handlers became more careful with their records. And the K9 program began reviewing procedures that had been taken for granted. The biggest change, however, happened with the dogs. Their feeding schedules became more consistent. Their performance was monitored alongside their nutrition. And handlers were reminded that a military working dog wasn't a machine that could simply be pushed harder when performance dropped. The animals needed rest, proper nutrition, medical supervision, and someone willing to notice when they weren't themselves. A month later, Sienna received a message. It was from Mason. There was a photograph attached. Rook stood beside him on a training field. The German shepherd looked completely different. Adult. Strong, focused. His ears were forward. His posture was confident, and in front of him sat his favorite training toy. Underneath the photograph, Mason had written, "He got his energy back." Sienna smiled. Then another message arrived. "Commander says, you probably saved more than one dog." Sienna stared at the screen. She looked through the veterinary wing window. Several military working dogs were being examined that morning. Healthy, active alt. She smiled. Maybe she had, not because she had performed some extraordinary procedure, but because she had noticed something small, something that could easily have been dismissed. And she had asked one simple question. Why isn't this dog acting like himself? That question had been enough to uncover a problem. And the consequences were about to reach far beyond Rook, because Commander Mercer had one final meeting scheduled. And this time, he wasn't calling the handlers into his office. He was calling the entire K9 command together. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the entire K9 command gathered inside the training conference room at Harbor Ridge Naval Medical Center. Handlers sat in the first rows. Veterinary staff stood along the walls. Command personnel occupied the front, and on the screen behind Commander Julian Mercer was a single photograph. Rook, the German Shepherd, stood on a training field, alert and focused, looking nothing like the exhausted dog who had arrived at the hospital weeks earlier. Mercer turned toward the room. "This is what we're supposed to see." Nobody spoke. He changed the slide. The next image showed Rook's earlier medical record: reduced energy, longer recovery, reduced food intake, declining performance. Mercer pointed toward the information. None of these observations were individually ignored. He paused. They were simply never connected. The room remained silent. He continued. "That changes today. The new procedures were straightforward. Every military working dog would have its feeding plan reviewed by veterinary staff. Changes would require documentation. Training schedules would be evaluated alongside nutrition. Unexpected fatigue would trigger a medical review rather than an automatic reduction in food. Handlers would receive additional training. And every K9 would have a designated veterinary contact for questions about diet, recovery, and performance. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated. Just a system designed to prevent small problems from becoming serious ones." Mercer looked around the room. "We don't need perfect people." He paused. "We need people who are willing to notice when something isn't right." His eyes moved toward the veterinary staff, then toward Sienna. She sat quietly near the back. She hadn't expected to be mentioned. Mercer continued. "One nurse noticed a dog wasn't acting like himself. He didn't name her immediately. She asked a question. The room turned toward Sienna. She looked uncomfortable. Mercer smiled. That's all it took." After the meeting, Mason found Sienna outside the conference room. "You're famous now." She laughed. "I absolutely don't want to be." He smiled. "Too late." Rook was standing beside him. The German Shepherd looked healthy now. His coat was bright. His eyes were alert, and his tail moved when he saw Sienna. She crouched. "Hey, Rook." He immediately walked toward her. Mason shook his head. "He remembers you." Sienna gently scratched his ears. "I remember him too." Rook looked up at her, then sat. Mason laughed. "That's his old command," Sienna smiled. "Maybe he's showing off." The improvement continued over the following weeks. Rook gradually returned to normal training. His stamina improved. His recovery time normalized. His appetite remained strong, and his handlers became more attentive to the small changes that could indicate a larger problem. One afternoon, Mason brought Rook back for another checkup. Sienna was working in the treatment area. Rook walked in. This time, he didn't look tired. He practically bounced through the doorway. Sienna smiled. "Someone's feeling better." Mason nodded. "He's back." Dr. Whitmore examined him. Everything looked good. She turned toward Mason. "He's ready for the next stage." Mason smiled. "Good." Rook stood beside him. Sienna looked at the dog. "Don't overdo it," Mason laughed. "I'll tell him." Rook looked at Sienna. She pointed at him. "I'm serious." His ears moved. Mason smiled. "I think he understands." Later that day, Commander Mercer visited the veterinary wing. He stopped beside Sienna. "I wanted to thank you properly." She smiled. "You already did." "Not for Rook." She looked confused. For the other dogs. Sienna looked at him. Mercer continued. Since we changed the procedures, we've already identified 2 K9s whose diets weren't matching their workload. Sienna's expression changed. Are they okay? They're fine. He smiled, because the problem was caught early. Sienna nodded. Mercer looked toward the treatment rooms. That's what I wanted you to understand. She waited. You didn't just help one dog. He paused. You helped us notice the system around him. Sienna smiled. That's a team effort. Mercer nodded. It is. That evening, Mason stopped by the nurse's station. He was carrying something. Sienna looked up. What is that? He placed a small envelope on the desk. Open it. She did. Inside was a photograph of Rook. He was standing beside Mason on the training field. His ears were forward. His posture was strong, and his eyes were focused. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. Thank you for noticing. Sienna looked up. Mason, he shrugged. He can't write. She laughed. So you wrote it for him? Someone had to. Sienna smiled. She carefully placed the photograph beside her computer. Weeks later, something happened that reminded Sienna why the story mattered. A young military working dog arrived for a routine examination. The handler reported that the dog had been slower than usual. The veterinary team began their examination. Sienna watched from across the room. The dog sat quietly, too quietly. She walked closer. How long? The handler looked at her. How long what? Has he been slower? About 10 days. Sienna nodded. What changed? The handler thought. Training increased. Sienna looked toward the veterinarian. Dr. Whitmore looked back. They both understood. The new system was already working. The dog's records were reviewed. His nutrition was adjusted appropriately under veterinary supervision. His workload was examined, and the issue was caught before the dog deteriorated. Sienna watched the young K9 leave the treatment room later that afternoon. He was already more alert. Dr. Whitmore smiled. See? Sienna nodded. Small things, exactly. If you've made it this far, subscribe if you want more stories about military K9s and the people who quietly protect the animals that protect others. And if you believe someone should always speak up when something feels wrong, tell us in the comments. Because sometimes one observation can make a much bigger difference than anyone realizes. Several months passed. Rook returned to full operational status. Mason sent occasional updates. Training was going well. His stamina was back. His appetite was excellent. And according to Mason, Rook had developed one new habit. Whenever they visited Harbor Ridge Naval Medical Center, he immediately looked for Sienna. One morning, Mason brought him in unexpectedly. Sienna was checking equipment when she heard paws behind her. She turned. Rook stood in the doorway. Her face lit up. Rook! The dog walked directly toward her. She crouched. He placed his head against her shoulder. Mason smiled. He remembered the place. Sienna laughed. I think he remembered the nurse. Mason nodded. Definitely. They walked outside together. The sunlight was bright over the naval base. Rook moved confidently beside Mason. Sienna walked on the other side. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then Mason said, You know what I learned? Sienna looked at him. What's that? Before that appointment, I thought a good handler was someone who could make his dog do anything. Sienna smiled. And now? Mason looked at Rook. Now I think a good handler is someone who notices when the dog is telling him something. Sienna nodded. That's probably closer. Mason smiled. Rook was trying to tell us for weeks. She looked at the dog. And eventually somebody listened. Rook stopped walking. He looked toward Sienna. She smiled. What? The German shepherd stepped closer. She placed a hand against his neck. "You don't have to thank me." Rook leaned into her. Mason laughed. "I think he disagrees." Sienna smiled. "Then tell him he's welcome." Mason looked at the dog. "She says you're welcome." Rook's tail moved. Later that afternoon, Sienna returned to the hospital. She walked past the veterinary wing, the same hallway, the same examination rooms, the same doors. But everything felt slightly different now. On one wall was a new K9 care board. It contained feeding schedules, training load reminders, hydration checks, recovery observations, and at the top was a simple sentence: "Know what normal looks like." Sienna stopped. She smiled, because that was exactly what she had done. She had known what normal looked like, and she had recognized when Rook wasn't normal. That was all. No secret technique, no dramatic intervention, no special title, just attention. The following year, Commander Mercer gave a short speech at a K9 training event. Several working dogs were present. Handlers stood proudly beside them. Veterinary staff attended. Sienna had been invited but stayed near the back. Mercer spoke about the importance of working dog welfare. He talked about nutrition, rest, training, medical oversight, and accountability. Then he said, "One of the most important lessons our program learned this year came from a routine appointment." Sienna looked down. Mercer continued. "A nurse noticed a dog was not himself." He looked across the crowd. "She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't assume. She asked questions. And because she did, we found a problem before it became something worse." The audience applauded. Sienna smiled. Then she noticed Rook standing near Mason. The German Shepherd was looking directly at her. She laughed quietly. Still watching. Mason heard her. Always. After the event, Sienna walked over to Rook. He immediately approached. She touched his muzzle. "You've gotten famous." Mason laughed. "He likes to think so." Rook looked between them. Sienna smiled. "Stay healthy." Mason nodded. "We will." She looked at the dog. "And don't skip your meals." Mason laughed. "Trust me, he never does." Rook's tail moved. Sienna smiled. "Good." As they walked away, Sienna watched them disappear across the training field. She thought about the first morning. Rook had entered the hospital looking tired, not dramatically sick, not visibly injured, just wrong. His energy was missing. His performance had changed, and the records had quietly documented the decline without explaining it. If she hadn't asked a question, perhaps nobody would have connected the pieces. Maybe nothing catastrophic would have happened. Maybe someone else would eventually have noticed. She would never know. But she did know one thing. A military working dog couldn't walk into a hospital and explain, "Something about my routine isn't right." He couldn't tell the veterinarian that he was constantly hungry. He couldn't explain why training had become harder. He couldn't point toward a spreadsheet and say, "Look at this." Someone had to notice. Someone had to listen. Someone had to care enough to ask why. That morning, it happened to be Sienna, and perhaps that was the most important lesson Rook left behind. Not that one nurse had saved a military K9. Not that one commander had disciplined several handlers. Not even that a diet had been corrected. The real lesson was much simpler. Working animals don't always need someone to speak for them. Sometimes they need someone to notice them. Rook had never been trying to fail. He had been trying to keep working while his body was telling everyone that something was wrong. And once the people around him finally listened, the solution wasn't complicated. It was proper food, proper oversight, proper rest, and a team willing to put the dog's welfare ahead of assumptions. Sienna never considered herself a hero. She went back to work the next morning. She checked her patients. She helped the veterinary team. She answered questions. She noticed small things, just like before. But somewhere on a naval training field, a healthy German shepherd named Rook was running again. His handler was beside him. His energy had returned. His work had meaning. And every time he came back for a medical checkup, there was one nurse he always seemed to remember. The nurse who had looked at him when everyone else saw a tired dog and quietly asked, "Why isn't he himself?" Sometimes, that's where saving someone begins. Not with a dramatic rescue. Not with a heroic speech. Just with one person paying enough attention to notice that something isn't right, and being brave enough to say, "We need to look closer."